We are going to start this session. The session will be chaired by my colleague Myung Chen and myself. The way it's going to happen is that we'll have a 10-minute introduction to the topic first, which is going to be about in search of equity and excellence in physics. But before we get started, we'd like to remind everybody about the code of conduct. And now, after the 10 minutes introduction by Myung Chen, we'll have a panel discussion. We have 2 panelists here in person, and we have 3 others online. And we look forward to a very fruitful session and discussion. So I will turn to Myung Chen now to do the introduction to the topic.
This is better. All right, so thanks, Katevi, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. As we meet here to plan for particle physics in the next decades and beyond, it is very important to reflect on ways through which we can achieve the highest level of scientific advancement possible. As Professor Jim Gates, one of our esteemed panelists, has reminded us, in several of his writings since 1995, almost 3 decades ago, that diversity is of great importance in biological evolution. An organism's genetic diversity is found to enhance the prospect of its long-term survival. The dialogue between African music and European music, this is another example. These practitioners, the conversation among them resulted in the birth of jazz. Right? As Professor Gates beautifully wrote, and I quote, "The diversity of conversationalists increases the chances for a heterosis to occur." As both classical and jazz music simultaneously exist today, we don't think that we are musically poor. On the other hand, had jazz never come into existence, we would have been musically poor, end quote. Within the academic settings, research in social sciences has found that diversity is a necessity to achieve highest level of excellence. It was found that diversity in a favorable institutional climates impact faculty retention. Diverse faculty body improve the teaching and learning environments for all students. Diverse team produce higher quality research outcomes and unique solutions to problems. Diversity in higher education is associated with enhanced economic growth as university graduate a workforce that is prepared to excel in globalized economy. So over the past 2.5 years during the SNOMAS process, we have collected information concerning diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in high energy physics, instances of successes and failures, and actions that have been taken for improvement. 32 letters of interest related to DEIA were submitted. There's echo. Other inputs came from surveys, town hall meetings, and discussions. Ultimately, 11 contributed papers were developed, which can be characterized in the following 7 areas. These include accessibility, wellness, climate, marginalized communities, excellence and equity, strategies in education outreach and inclusion, as well as the importance to engage Africa and Latin America. So today, during the panel today, we will be focusing on the topic of in search of excellence and equity in physics. Our institutions have prided themselves as a meritocracy, which is a system where people's capacity and desire to learn and work in the academy are the only considerations in assessing the quality of or merits in their past achievements and their future potential for excellence. It is expected that an equal chance for everyone to advance and obtain rewards purely based on their individual merits and efforts, regardless of their gender, race, or other non-merit factors. In utopia, where everyone in the society has an equal starting point, this leads to pure meritocracy. And of course, we don't live in utopia, and we know not everybody has the same starting point. So the ideal of meritocracy is often misguided, as the unearned privilege often gets ignored in how we evaluate and reward achievements. What is valued in the workplace is not necessarily based on skills or abilities, but rather on signals such as a strong handshake or the appropriate attire, right? It is thus important to understand the mechanisms of privilege and disentangle true merits from empty signals that are known only to the privileged in group. Given the blindness to this unearned privilege, meritocracy exacerbates inequalities, resulting in underrepresentations of certain groups, which in turn limits the intellectual excellence that we can achieve. Furthermore, as Costella and Bernard pointed out, an increased focus on meritocracy in society has led to justification of rewards based on merit, thereby turned a blind eye to discrimination or privilege at work. All right, so strive for a higher level of excellence. It is thus important to acknowledge that not all people are on the same footing when it comes to access and inclusion in academy. And then turn this awareness into change by taking upon ourselves the agency to drive culture change, by providing support to bridge the gap caused by inequalities that result from institutional or societal barriers, and by making ourselves and our leadership accountable. By utilizing research, education, engagement as vehicles for fostering diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility through sustaining and sincere efforts. In return, DIA will lead to greatest extent to excellence in our scientific endeavors. And this, of course, these efforts benefit everybody in our community, including the meritocrats. Right, so as Professor Gates wrote, the broadest possible manifestation of diversity is a critical force multiplier to the learning process for all students. In a broadly diverse classroom, all students does benefit from hearing the different questions posed in the education arena, right? Fostering, oh, yes. Yes, fostering habit to be prudent, a prudent strategy for the development of innovation in the thinking of students, in addition to enhancing each student's mastery of existing science. All right, so today we are very fortunate to have a group of esteemed panelists to share their perspectives and expertise on this topic. Professor Jim Gates is past APS president. He is a director of the Brown Theoretical Physics Center and Ford Foundation professor at Brown University. Among his long list of accomplishments and recognitions, he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. For his fundamental contribution to supersymmetry and supergravity. Professor Gates has received the National Medal of Science and served in President Obama's Council of Advisory on Science and Technology. Professor Julie Posselt is Associate Dean of the Graduate School and Associate Professor of Higher Education at USC. She is a director of the iGen Network, which include the APS Bridge Program and the CalBridge Program, and also provided strong support for the CalBridge Program. She is an expert on inclusive graduate education, and her 2016 book, entitled Graduate Admission, Merit, Diversity, and Faculty Gatekeeping, has led to numerous collaborations among institutions to re-examining their practice in She is also a distinguished professor of physics at Duke University and was a vice chancellor for academic affairs at Duke Kunshan University. She is an APS fellow for her extensive important contributions in nuclear physics, in particular in the area of quark hadron transition and the determinations of nucleon form factor. So on the stage, joining us in person, we have Professor Kevin Black, who is on the CMS collaboration. Professor Black is Associate Chair for Graduate Studies and Professor of Physics at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is an LPC co-coordinator and is serving on the CMS Diversity and Inclusion Committee. He was elected to the US LHC Users Organization Executive Committee, and his research expertise is in the new particle and new interaction searches. Last but not the least, Professor Sekar Chivukula is chair-elect of PDF and is a distinguished professor at UC San Diego. He was formerly associate provost for undergraduate education and Dean of Undergrad Studies at Michigan State University. Professor Chivukula has served on HEPAP and is a fellow of APS and AAAS for his important contribution to BSM theories and electroweak symmetry breaking. So during the first hour of the panel, we will have prepare a set of questions on each of the three topics, three broad areas that I show on the slides. And each panelist would have 3 minutes to share their perspectives on the question directed to them. Afterwards, we will have a few minutes for other panelists to share their comments, and also for the audience to share comments or ask questions directly related to that area. During the last 20 minutes, we will open the floor for the audience to ask questions that aren't covered earlier. And also thanks to those who have submitted questions, which we already, some of them we already incorporated in the questions posted to the panelists. So without further ado, I'm just going to turn over to Katevi to start us off.
All right, so we're going to start the first part of our interactions with the panelists. So the first question goes to Professor Jim Gates. Professor Gates, would you please define for us the concept of excellence in scientific achievements? We cannot hear you.
Thank you, Katebe. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can someone indicate if you can hear me? Thumbs up would do. Say thank you to all of our colleagues who are, thank you, Julie, to all of our colleagues who are on this Zoom session. This is a very complicated and difficult subject for all of us to engage. And as I was mentioned in Professor Chin's introduction, this is something I've been thinking about and doing some small amount of writing since 1995. Some people who were instrumental in getting me to think about these issues, the person most instrumental was Abdus Salam. Abdus Salam was the creator of the International Center for Theoretical Physics. And I apologize, I'm outside, as you could probably tell, the sun is moving, so the brightness of my face is going to shift as we have the presentation. But Professor Salam made it possible for me in the early 80s to spend about 5 consecutive summers at the International Center for Theoretical Physics. I didn't have grant support for this, and so I was hosted by the center. And eventually I figured out that Professor Salam probably had a reason for why he wanted me to come and spend time at the center. Namely, it was one of the few places in the world where I could see the entire world's various demographics coming together to produce excellent physics. After all, I was educated in the United States. If some of you know about my biographical trajectory, I was an undergrad and graduate student at MIT, a postdoc at Harvard, and a postdoc at Caltech. Those are not places that to this day are very diverse, and they certainly were a lot less diverse 40 years ago. And so what is it that I came away from this exposure to diversity in physics? Well, one of the things that I came to understand was that physics relies on creativity in a way that I had not understood at prior points in my career. In particular, Professor Chen spoke about my writings about education and multiple pathways to answers. Well, that's true in the classroom, but it's also even more true in research. So when people ask me about how do I define excellence, what I define is the ability to use new and innovative thinking and models to produce results that no one has produced before. I think that's a pretty good definition. And that can be extended to whether it is theoretical work, because I am, after all, sort of I tell people I'm a fallen mathematician. All my work is mathematical physics. But it can also be applied to someone in the laboratory who's constructing devices and thinking of codes and apps in new ways and new uses of materials. So this ability to think what we say is outside the box, that to me is part of excellence in physics. And I think that's a pretty good definition in lots and lots of areas.
Well, thank you, Professor Gates.
And so
Sorry, please continue.
I'm sorry, was that a signal for me to stop?
Please finish.
Okay, so the final thing I wanted to say is excellence to me is a hard thing. It's something that exists for us in the discipline, and that we must have that as one of our dedicated places as we make discussions about how to make physics more vital. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gates. We have a follow-up question. Some people think that being inclusive means sacrificing excellence. Do you agree? Why or why not?
I do not agree based on my experiences for about 40 years. Although our discipline is not diverse, you can see a history where diversity actually contributes to the progress of physics. This goes back almost to the start. I like to tell people to joke physics, but it was very quickly taken up in France, right? And there's a historical rivalry there between those two countries. And why was it taken up so broadly? And then obviously we have great traditions of, for example, Chandra Shankar or Bose or a whole host of colleagues from the Indian subcontinent. And so if you ask, do these people bring a slightly different viewpoint that has contributed to physics? I think the record is pretty clear that it does. Is it rooted in some way in their subconscious and culture? I would argue yes, because you see, one thing I'd like to compare physics and mathematics to is music. And we know that music is richer because of diversity. And we also know from psychologists that there are correlations between musical ability and mathematical ability. That would suggest that more diversity in mathematics would produce a more innovative structure.
Thank you, Professor Gates. So now I would like to direct the next question to Professor Poslet. Can the observed underrepresentation in physics be explained by a functioning meritocracy?
Yeah, thank you for the question. My name is Julie Posselt, and I'm really honored to be a part of this important conversation. I think the starting point with what excellence is fundamental. And Michelle Lamont, a Harvard sociologist, likes to say that excellence is in the eye of the beholder. And those of us who study disciplinary cultures know that different fields of study will conceptualize what excellence looks like differently, and even sub-communities within disciplines might think of it differently. But how we define merit or excellence, how we recognize it, and how we reward it are all of how meritocracies, even in an idealized sense, function. So inequalities could be, and indeed often are, a function of what characteristic qualities we think constitute merit or excellence. They're also a function of how those qualities are distributed in the population that we're thinking about at a key moment of selection. And they're effectively a part of how we recognize those qualities if we're a part of the group that's trying to pursue them. So for example, if I'm a faculty member deciding whether or not it's time to go up for tenure, and I look at the qualities of my peers, I might make a decision about whether to go up based on whether I think my record aligns with what is represented as excellence among those who have associate professor and tenured status. So I guess I would argue that in a democracy of ours, which is diverse and increasingly so, one that is founded on striving for equal opportunity, how those of us who have gatekeeping responsibilities, who are the meritocrats effectively, are relating merit, defining merit, and defining in ways that include space for diversity. It's a question of really deep importance. So I appreciated Dr. Chen's comments very much that, and I think they're well aligned with what the American Association of Colleges and Universities, the AAC&U, says, that we have to join the principles of merit and diversity, of excellence and diversity, in an integrated idea of inclusive excellence, and that this is actually critically important to the well-being of democratic culture, if part of a characteristic of the democracy is its diversity. One aspect of the functioning meritocracy question is that it's been since 1978, when the Supreme Court's decision in Bakke versus the University of California Regents argued that academic performance is not the only standard by which we should be judging who should have access to elite academic opportunities. And indeed, we see that qualifications rarely are the only consideration about who deserves opportunities. In admissions, for example, when we select only on academic qualities, you can quickly run into an arms race where you end up preferring people who already have the skills and knowledge and experiences that educational programs exist to provide. Research amply shows that things like fit and match, hiring and admissions often trump qualifications. And we know that fit is something that's cultural. We see it in things like the handshake, as Dr. Chen mentioned. We also see it by whether we feel good about a person because of how much they're smiling in an interview or perhaps not smiling too much. Or obviously fundamentally things like whether a person has the research interests and skills that we're looking for relative to the questions we think are important or the projects that we're looking to fulfill. Now, I think how we recognize that in time comes to necessarily evolve along with our notions of what the field needs. Every discipline has its core and every discipline is evolving. And so our ability to allow our ideals of excellence and what constitutes excellence for selection should summarily evolve along with it.
Thank you, Professor Poslet. I would like to direct the next question to Professor Shivukula, who is in the audience with us here. So if meritocracy hinders advancement of physics, can we as a community change that? How?
Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to see everyone here this late after several hours at Snowmass. Before turning to the question, I think it's useful to sometimes acknowledge milestones that are positive, even when we're talking about things that maybe we wish to change. And I'd like to acknowledge that yesterday we saw something I think different in the field that we haven't seen before at the end of the day, where the senior DOE representative, the Fermilab director, and the HEPAP chair who were here speaking to us were all women. Now, that doesn't mean that we're in any sense, there, that somehow gender equality has been achieved, but I think it is useful to at least acknowledge positive milestones when they occur. So now back to your regularly scheduled program. So first, I'd like to say that we often think that explicit bias and hostility is past in our field and that it no longer occurs. And that's unfortunately not true. And it may be useful in this regard to think, to see what was found by the Ad Hoc Committee on LGBT issues about 7 years ago. And I'll quote from their report: a single demographic question was added to the APS member survey in 2015 that was sent to a random sample of 30% of APS members on October 13th, 2015. A total of 2,596 responses, response rate of about 22%. Now, what was notable was the presence within the response to that survey of a small but significant number, 21, of strongly negative responses to the existence of the question at all on the survey. These responses fell into two main categories: denying the relevance of the question or objecting to the question as offensive. Now, while it might be tempting to say that 21 is small compared to 2,600, it's important to understand that these colleagues felt empowered to respond in entirely unprofessional ways. The statement about strong negative responses was a euphemism in case you didn't catch it. Strongly unprofessional ways to the mere addition of one demographic question, which they themselves were free to ignore. It doesn't take many bad apples to spoil the climate in the barrel. So the first thing I think we need to do as individuals is find ways to speak out when we see obvious bias and harassment occurring. I know from personal experience that it's easy to duck, and it can be an uncomfortable thing to do in the heat of the moment because you're not quite sure if you heard that thing or how much you want to take on at that time. And that's okay, but I think over time, each of us have to learn how to stand up for that, how to find allies in our own departments, in our institutions, how to learn to navigate our institutional reporting mechanisms that are at our disposal to be able to actually address those things when they occur. A second thing to consider is that one bad experience can have a disproportionately harmful effect on the career of a scientist from an underrepresented group, especially a young scientist. But on the other hand, strong and positive and affirming experiences can have a strong positive effect. Many of us who are here had the privilege of attending a conference just before this for Ann Nelson from the University of Wisconsin, who tragically, a member of our community who tragically died in a climbing accident in 2019. Anne was committed to addressing underrepresentation in physics, and she was the author, as you may all recall, of the provocative APS backpage article entitled "Diversity in Physics, Are You a Problem?", where she argued that if you weren't doing something positive to address the issue, you were in fact part of the problem. Now, Anne was an extraordinary scientist, but on top of that, she was a tremendous mentor to many students. And it was obvious to those of us who were at the conference, who saw the wonderful, young, diverse set of scientists who spoke, that she really, she lived that in life. And so that's, I think, another practice that we can learn, that, learning to be an ally and especially to be a mentor to a diverse group of students or colleagues can have a profound impact on time. Now, there's Dr. Posalt and Dr. Gates have already talked about these issues of excellence versus merit, which is coming more toward the topic of the question. It was explained in a number of the white papers, which I recommend to you. It's also recently described in a book called Misconceiving Merit by Mary Blair Loy and Aaron Check, that we often use shortcuts. Evaluating excellence actually takes work. And so we often use shortcuts to be able to do this in a fixed amount of time, or perhaps because we're not paying enough attention. So, there are some examples that we're all familiar with. We all have the colleague who is not always right, but is never uncertain. And we all learn, I think, from, in many cases, beginning from the behavior of our instructors in our classes, that to associate confidence, the confidence of assertion with the ability to respond quickly with expertise. And those are two different things, right? Those are not really the same thing. So we know this is faulty, but it's hard to ignore that social programming. And to make things worse, of course, the individuals most able to assume this personality are often the most privileged in our society. And so it's not an option that's available to all. An easier example maybe is in our research expertise that Dr. Posalt reflected on. Usually, we're interested in a fairly narrow area of our science and research at any given time. And of course, for natural reasons, we think that's really important. It's much easier for us to evaluate things in our narrow area of expertise than to take the time and effort to really evaluate something outside. And that's another thing that we can do. So, a third thing we need to do is not be seduced by sort of misleading markers of merit, and to adopt evaluation mechanisms that open us up to the possibility that excellence doesn't look like us or doesn't look like the way we might think. And Dr. Posalt is an expert on especially this process in graduate admissions. It might be worth noting that this issue of being seduced by mismeasures of merit is maybe potentially a bigger issue for us in STEM, because we're used to the idea in our research that there are clear-cut, direct answers to our questions, and we assume that if we have the same kind of emotional response in a different context, that the same level of authority and certainty must transfer. And that's not the case. We have to learn not to do that. Finally, it's probably worth noting that progress on these issues have been really slow, and it's worth asking why they've been slow. There's an old saying in the business literature, right, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So why is it? What is it about culture, and how is it that culture works, right? So one answer to this, there are many reasons, of course, but one answer is really in terms of game theory, like the prisoner's dilemma. What makes game theory interesting is that your decision in any given moment depends on what you think other people think. What makes game theory even more interesting is their higher order effects. It's not just what each player believes another will do, but what each player believes other players will believe others will do. So there are higher and higher order effects that need to be taken into account. So changing culture, it's not enough to just change the hearts and minds of one person, right? That person has to have some confidence that they live in a structure, in a culture, in a system that will acknowledge and at least not punish them, if not reward them, say, for standing up for diversity, equity, and inclusion in physics. So I think this is something where professional organizations like the APS and the DPF can play a particularly strong role. I mean, one example is the fact that we're discussing it here. When I think back at the institutions I've been at, the number of colleagues I could say were actively interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion at any given time wasn't perhaps a majority, or wasn't even necessarily an obviously large number of people. But being able to build community, being able to feel and know that when you look at what your professional organization, what the APS is doing with much of which Dr. Gates was involved with as well, is one way that we can start to understand that we're not alone in this.
Thank you. I would like to give an opportunity to Professor Black to comment on the issue before we ask the audience to weigh in.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what was said there. And I think one of the things that I've noticed as a member of a large collaborations and also a member of the physics department is that there is it's very difficult to get uniform agreement on nearly anything, right? As we see also here in snowmass, let alone issues that people feel very passionate about and very strongly about in one way or the other. But the fundamental thing which can really be a game changer is to have leadership in the organization, whether it's a department, a university, or a collaboration, which really takes that seriously and takes it as something that they can build on. And when you get those people involved and active in the success of it, and to take an active role in it, that can really make quite a difference, because people, especially younger people, tend to react to the environment that they're in, and to see that as a model of how that they should act. And so I think it's really important to make sure that the leaders take this as a serious thing upon themselves, to realize that their actions are more than just their individual actions, but how they can model this for communities, and how they can bring the importance of these topics to the greater public.
Thank you. So we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. Any questions for the panelists?
Thank you all for being here. This is wonderful. I'm curious, has anybody done anything where you've done like peer mentoring for people, where some people have been able to reach out and learn how to mentor effectively, and then peer mentor other faculty or other collaborators? Has this worked anywhere? Do we know how that turns out, or does that go horribly pear-shaped?
So any of our panelists want to answer? Professor Gates?
In the introduction, it was mentioned that I was at Brown University, and up until the 1st of this month, that was true, but I resigned from Brown. I'm returning to College Park. However, there's a very interesting experiment with peer mentoring going on at Brown right now. Brown has made more progress in terms of diversifying its STEM faculty than any other Ivy League institution that I know of. And one of the things that is clear is that there's a self-sustaining community there of broadly diverse individuals. It's not just by gender, it's not just by ethnicity, you name the axis. And this group comes together to celebrate each other, to support each other, to provide information, inside information on how the university works. And I've never seen anything like this at any other university in my life. So it's an experiment that I think should be watched very carefully.
Yeah, I can speak to something similar that's happening at an institutional level. Dr. Chipakula is a member of a consortium that I helped found that was initially funded by the National Science Foundation and now by the Sloan Foundation. It started out as the California Consortium for Inclusive Doctoral Education, and now we've expanded nationally to the Equity in Graduate Education Consortium. And in the same way as bringing together individuals who are committed to peer mentoring one another in capacity with and for equity, participants and universities that are collectively committed to working together to provide guidance, to learn from each other, to share our successes, to share our struggles with institutional change efforts. So I think, as in so many things, as the adage goes, we're better together, we're stronger together, and it's in part because when we have the safety and trust and respect to actively learn from each other, to take a position of celebrating each other's successes, but also having the humility and vulnerability to admit when we've got material to learn, there's a lot more power. There's also opportunity for a little bit of positive peer pressure, I think. And so I'm not sure if the original question concerns mentoring practice specific or just peer mentoring in the work of improving equity, diversity, and inclusion. But certainly there's powerful evidence for both of those things.
So before we take another question, I would like to go to Professor Gao and give her an opportunity to also comment on the issue. We cannot hear you.
So you asked me to comment on the question about peer mentoring, or just in general?
Excellence.
Yeah, thank you. I think that one thing we have learned over the years is really the notion that when you think about, I think that the panelists already have covered that very well, is the notion that actually when you think about diversity, it actually leads to excellence. And this is something has been very well documented, not just in academia, but also in terms of the society. When you have a diverse group of people, you make a better decision. And the company also, overall just also have better outcome. So I think that this is certainly a very, very important aspect, which is really diversity leads to excellence. I just wanted to add this point.
Thank you. So another question from the audience before.
Yes, in my hometown, there was a lot of inequality between high schools by race. And so the predominantly white schools received a lot more resources than the predominantly Black schools. And so as a result, there was a lot of individuals with high potential relative to their level of preparation. And these are the type of individuals what we've done a bad job of engaging with in the past and have a lot of value to share. So my question is, what can we do as a community to address inequalities before they happen at the college level?
Professor Gao, you want to comment on that?
So the question has to do with the kind of resources not equitable when it comes to K-12 education.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that this is actually a very, indeed, this is actually a very difficult and challenging situation. And I think that we as physicists, I think this is the kind of community engagement. I think that a professional society like APS and physicists, we can actually have an important role to play. And by really share the kind of passion we have in science and go to those schools and just to show the students, show the kids, the kind of excitement of science. And actually it does not take a lot just to go to the classroom, go to the rural areas, and you can bring very exciting science experiment to show. And we can also organize events, on the weekend. But I think that, and the other thing we can do is really to engage science teachers at those schools just to provide the kind of support.
All right, so we take one question from Zoom. Huh?
Jeremy, you can ask your question.
Okay, thanks. I was wondering if the panelists have anything to say about the role that consensus plays in making progress on EDI issues. For example, I heard one of the panelists earlier allude to a way that a small number of vocal community members can kind of stand in the way of making real changes very effectively, status quo. And on the other hand, it's hard to make culture change from the top down. So I'm curious what you think about what kind of consensus we should be looking for, whether it has qualitative aspects we should be looking for, if there's some kind of target threshold of agreement and so on.
Right, so now we'll move on to topics, which we
So I think I can take a crack at that. I mean, the questioner is, Jeremy, I guess is absolutely correct. On after versus individual problem that I was trying to speak to, and there's always a lag. Even if the majority of individuals are moving in some direction, culture changes much more slowly because culture, as I tried to argue, also has to do with what people think is in the environment that they're in. And so to come back to the issue of what can organizations like the APS do, for example, one of the things that the DPF does is to have a mentoring award. And our mentoring award is a way of really demonstrating to our community, showing our community's commitment to actually trying to address some of these cultural issues. So even if a particular mentor awardee is in a department, say that's in transition from one aspect of or one set of acceptance of diversity and inclusion to another, these sort of visible awards and visible community recognitions are a way for us to move our community forward. It doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight or that it's going to be quick, but it's at least one path forward.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad to add a little bit to that as well. Paul Gorski, who studies racial equity in education, has, I think, wisely said that the pace of change tends to favor the comfort of the privileged. And so the question around consensus is an important one when we think about where the challenge to consensus comes from. People who have studied the emergence of consensus in organizations say that it often follows kind of an amoeba pattern where there's about 20% that's pushing out in a new direction, 60% that's sort of the passive majority, and then a small number that will be sort of standard bearers for the way things have been. And so if we wait to have 100%, in support of any new thing, we won't see much change at all. So I think what leaders can do is both reward innovations, and societies are a great angle for doing that. But leaders can also pay attention to those dynamics of 20, 60, 20% and ensure that when there is the concern from a 20% that's representing a viewpoint that's at odds with what it seems like those who are advocating something related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, you don't necessarily ignore it, but you manage it with care, recognizing that is likely to be something that is slowing down something within a field that's already struggling with change in some ways, but also that physics, and especially I think high energy physics it's a relatively high consensus field. It's built on a lot of intellectual consensus. Over time, it's relatively centralized, it's relatively hierarchical. So, denying consensus would be unwise if what you want is to move a culture, but waiting for 100% agreement in the formation of consensus will also always hold the community back.
All right, so thanks for all the responses and comments, and apology for now we are ready to move on to the next segment, which concerns challenges faced when we implement DEI. And the very first question concerning this topic, I would like to direct to Professor Gao. How to avoid the risk that EDI efforts and activities become meaningless checkboxes? Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And I think that I wanted to address this very briefly from 3 areas. One is really to think about the impact, and one is to think about individual engagement, and one is to think about culture and the value. And I think that when it comes to impact, it is important to think about the impact of our efforts and activities, especially the longer term impact, and to have a strategy. And we can take experimental particle nuclear physics as an example. Often we know that it takes substantial infrastructure and critical mass to build up research capability. So we have been thinking about, if we can establish joint faculty positions between national labs and minority serving institutions, and they will help to establish a sustainable pipeline for a diverse workforce development. And it is also important to think about these efforts really should involve, engage all members of the community instead of just the effort of small part of the community. Only when all the members are engaged, we can make true progress. So one very good example is to think about women in science. As you know, this is not an issue just for women, and it is really for all scientists. And DEI also, diversity, equity, inclusion really should be in everything we do. Instead of thinking or treating it as something actual or additional we need to do, they should be a very important part of our value. And I think that we need to establish at a very personal and also very deep level of awareness and understanding of DEI. And to me, this is an individual journey for each one of us, as we have very different backgrounds and different experiences. It has been taking quite some time to understand and appreciate many challenges colleagues from underrepresented groups face and live through. And I continue to go. Many years ago, really helped me understand some of the challenges women physicists faced in US, as I grew up in China and had a very different experience. My son was born in US and went to a university with a very diverse student population. And it was my son who helped me to understand some of the challenges Black and African-American young men experienced in US. And I think such a personal journey is highly valuable as it helps us to embrace DEI and to integrate DEI into our values. So I think that these are the points I want to make, which is really to think about impact, to think about individual engagement, and also to think about DEI as the core values of everything we do, so that we can avoid the risk that DEI efforts and activities become meaningless checkboxes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next question, this will be for Professor Black. How to address misconduct at education institutions, in research collaborations, in funding agencies?
Yeah, so this is an issue, that we've been struggling with in various contexts, I think. And so I can say that I've had a couple different roles. One is the graduate chair, and also as previous chair of the diversity committee at my university department, and also as trying to address this issue also in CMS as a member of the diversity committee, and member of one of the implementation task force for diversity. And I think there are various levels, of this, both and also there are issues which are severe, right? That we know about. There are special offices that deal with it, in that it's elevated to beyond the level which an individual can really deal with. So that's really what we would call the UW hostile and intimidating behavior, or Title IX violations, or sexual harassment or abuse, or other things like that, where there are clear in which we need to report to and to go to. But the other thing that we've noticed, especially in my experience, it has been things that don't quite fall into that category, which I would categorize now, I think the word that we use, microaggressions, that it's not something that you would really go to HR with. It's not something that rises to that level. And an individual one comment you might or something like that that occurred, it might not mean that much to you. But as they build up over time, it's kind of the death by 1,000 cuts. And so what we've been trying to deal with also is to make mechanisms and put them in place in which people can report them, and to either in the department to either staff members or to faculty members. And then the first question that we ask is, what would you like to see done about this? Would you like, what was your ideal outcome that you would like to see? And then, so most of those that I have dealt with, when I brought this up to the person who that were being complained about, they didn't even realize that something had happened, right? And this is a statement that we had discussed previously, that intent and impact is not the same. And when it was mentioned to them, then they kind of, got really concerned, and then kind of realized that perhaps thought about their actions, and they moved forward. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to do a better job of, because as Sekar had said before, that a lot of those things we tend to just ignore because they don't rise to this obvious level of very bad conduct, which everyone would agree is ridiculous, but yet sets the atmosphere and the tone of how we interact with each other, both at the university or collaboration level. The thing that is I think more difficult to deal with is how we deal with it in a setting like the research setting, where there's no particular university office, or there's no particular provenance of who is supposed to handle this, right? When you're over a Zoom meeting or something like this, and it didn't even physically happen in any particular space, right? So it's not the university, it's not CERN or Fermilab, it's in the ether, right? And so I think that's where we have to as collaborations, put mechanisms into place, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do in CMS, for example.
Thank you very much. So now I'm going to open to the panelists who have not commented on these two questions, a chance to add your thoughts. So maybe start with Professor Chivukula, if you have any additional thoughts.
Not really. I think that a good job was done by all. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Gates.
So I have one concern. And that is, it comes back to the thing that we started discussing, excellence. Yes, we need to deal with all these factors that contribute to a hostile environment, but it has to be done in such a way that we are not encouraging people to lose track of the fact that we are engaged in an activity that demands just as high a level of achievement as does athletics, for that matter. In athletics, no one would want to have a team that's not capable of being successful. And so as we encourage, it must, in my mind, it has always been that I encourage, but with the idea, with what's often called a growth mindset. And that's not something I've heard discussed today, is that oftentimes people who are trying to be helpful are not, in fact, engaged in a way that demonstrates a growth mindset. So in some sense, you have to get your own head right about what you believe people are capable of doing as you try to do this work.
Thank you. Professor Posselt.
Yeah, Professor Gates's comments are actually really well aligned with what was coming to mind as Dr. Black was speaking, which is that if we can maintain a community posture of learning about how we engage in this work, whether we're talking about how we engage with one another in the management of microaggressions that we may or may not recognize have occurred until after we're called on them, or whether it's about how we support the development of students in having a growth mindset as opposed to something more fixed. I think the more we can bring our attitude of being learners to this work, the more likely we are to both achieve that standard of excellence in our scholarship and to rise to a level of excellence in terms of creating a community that's inclusive and that is supportive. So I do see a lot of potential in continuing to center learning, even in a community that deeply values and thrives on expertise and excellence.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to open the floor to invite questions from the audience in regard directly related to the discussion of this section on the challenges.
Thanks. Hi, so this is Elizabeth Worcester for people online. One of the challenges that I think I faced when I tried to be involved in DEI activities is that often these things face a higher level of scrutiny than other kinds of activities, and people are very cautious about getting it right and making sure that everything is being done according to laws. I don't often meet with lawyers in my physics work, but I meet with lawyers all the time when we're doing DEI things. And at some level that may be necessary, but I wondered if you all had thoughts about whether that sort of higher level of scrutiny is causing a roadblock or is appropriate. Yeah, I think that's the question.
Any panelists would like to respond?
I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share an example, because I'm not quite understanding the question.
I'm trying to think if I can example that is not too specific. I feel like when you propose some new initiative in certain spaces, there's an attitude of, sure, let's try. And if you propose a DEI initiative, often there's like, oh, but what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And maybe we should talk to the lawyers. And there's like a lot of sort of concern and scrutiny of the idea in a way that doesn't happen as much in other spaces. And maybe that's just been my experience, but that's one of the things I wanted to ask you all about, if you think that's a common problem that people face in trying to introduce new initiatives.
So maybe Professor Persault can talk to this more directly, but certainly in California, we are under a state law that restricts what we can do in the space that has to do with admission of students, for example, or we can't take actions that would necessarily call out, that would preferentially treat one group versus another. So that's certainly an area where we are responding to and are seeing heightened scrutiny. And that has multiple aspects. There's the institutional level, but also I find that it happens within the department, right? Within your own institution, that those people, the 20% that Dr. Persault talked about, can weaponize that concern as a way of trying to prevent or obstruct change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're on the same wavelength. I think that my first response would be understand the motivation for the scrutiny. Is it that there's a legitimate concern about whether the action may be in violation of the 14th Amendment or other legal standards? Or is it is the skepticism something that just needs to be overcome because we're dealing in a domain of racism and sexism that isn't a part of our organization? Is it actively a source of a means of slowing down the possible change? So, there's a great book written by Keisha Thomas called Diversity, Resistance in Organizations that I would recommend. It's an edited volume, nice short chapters. But one of the things that it talks about is that diversity resistance takes many forms. And you can't immediately be, assuming that every scrutiny is about resistance. Sometimes it is about legitimate organizational design issues. And especially within organizations that don't have a long history of doing work in this area, that spirit of experimentation does need some care or guidance. But yeah, sort of disentangling that scrutiny from the underlying motivation may be a good first step.
So one thing I just wanted to briefly add was a specific example of this type of thing that occurred was that we had a junior faculty at Wisconsin who came up with this great idea of having a dedicated fellowship for undergraduate Black students who are interested in physics. And so it came up, and he wanted to name it after also one of our early graduate students, was like in the 1920s, I think, who was the fourth Black person in the US to get a PhD, and worked with George Breet when he was briefly at UW. And we were all excited about it, and we're ready to put it out. And then we were kind of then slowed down by the administrator. Said, "Well, we have to check with legal on this. Can you really put this out? Because does this violate some sort of law about opportunity, et cetera?" And indeed, legal's advice was, you can't quite phrase it like this, and you have to change the wording of it. So it still exists. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to implement exactly how we would wanted it to. And it's, one of the examples they gave was that there was a recent case where they had hired some administrators who were going to work on improving underrepresented minorities at the University of Wisconsin, which is primarily a white serving institution, frankly. And they immediately got a notice from some sort of citizens group that was saying, you can't have this thing because it's specific for minorities and not for everybody. And they had to retract the ad and things like that. So unfortunately, that's part of what I think you see this increased scrutiny for, is because there are unfortunately people who despite best intentions will go to the letter of the law and do things like that. And so there's a lot of kind of carefulness in it, especially along if you ask legal or something like that administrations.
I think we can take one question.
Hi, my name is Gustav Boymans. I'm at Columbia. I was wondering, what I'm struggling with in the past year or so is that while there was a lot of enthusiasm for joining DEI committees and stuff like that after the murder of George Floyd, that enthusiasm seems to be ebbing. It's not that people are opposed to it, but their enthusiasm to actually do work and spend time is going down. I see another side effect. Most of us, for example, dropped the GRE requirement following some of Professor Posselt's work. And we now see pressure to reinstate that across universities, et cetera. I was wondering if you had any recommendations as to how we can remotivate people or encourage people to be willing to spend some of their time. It's true, everybody is very busy, but to free up some of their time to work on these issues. As we know, when efforts have to be sustained by a couple of people in a department, that's just not sustainable. And so when we see that, only a few people are doing this. So I was wondering if you had any recommendations as to how we can drum up some enthusiasm again and get people to sacrifice some of their time for this. In particular, senior people, right? I mean, we don't have too much trouble finding a few graduate students and undergrads and even the postdoc. But if the faculty don't buy in, then it's not going to work.
Perhaps let's start with Professor Gao. Yeah, this is a very good question. And so this is what I was trying to say, the last part, which is really, I think that everybody has a journey, and I think that it takes a village to educate your colleagues, educate everybody. But I also think it's important. We need to give our colleagues space and time, because everybody will have this important moment. So what I really would recommend is really to have a conversation, to share experiences, so that you can understand why some of us are very passionate. And it is important for all of us to be very passionate, because at the end of the day, we are all human beings, and we wanted, what is better for all of us. And I think this, this takes some time. But I also think that, talking with your colleagues and share individuals' experience and moments, it is very, very important. Professor Black.
One thing I can can add to that response also is that I think we are seeing now that, I think a lot of the traditional way of deciding like who we're going to hire for faculty or for other things has been primarily based on research and that alone. Now we do see some institutions which are coming out with, asking for diversity plans or what plans that they plan to do for work. And I think in that area, and from my experience, actually the physics is behind compared to a lot of different areas which are now taking this quite seriously. So I think that in the future, it will change. Yes, absolutely. The problem is that now, it's still very much, except for maybe a few people, it's still very much primarily based on the research output. And until that changes, it's not going to make much progress.
Yeah, thanks.
Maybe if I could add just one thing. I mean, this is a place where institutional leadership really, really matters because faculty respond, there's some faculty that are dedicated to this and are going to work on it no matter what. But other faculty will have to choose, what sort of things they want to work on based on what they think is recognized and appreciated. And that's one of the areas where leadership has more flexibility, perhaps than others, is how that they are able to recognize and appreciate a wider portfolio of activity.
Yes, so I think this is a very good segue into the next section.
All right, so we're gonna go to the last part. We are running late, so we will omit some questions. So in the last part, we want to talk about creating opportunities through collective efforts for broader participation to achieve inclusive excellence. I would like to address the first question to Dr. Poslet. How can we improve DEI through education? What are the best practices in making education more inclusive?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's definitely not a 3-minute question. I published a book addressed kind of broadly and felt like it was much too short a book. So I'm going to distill just a few things that I think are critically important. And one directly follows the discussion that we were just having, which I heard in the question, how do we sustain energy once a spark is kind of like lit? And in my research and in the communities that I've been a part of, I see that a huge part of leadership is managing the dialogue around change and ensuring that as there is the natural ebb and flow that comes with any exciting new idea and the motivation that surrounds it, that there is support for the labor that is inherently involved in it. So one of the things that I see in the physics community, including some people in the room today, is the power of leadership that's willing to take bold action, that's willing to manage personalities, that's willing to create new incentives, and that's willing to reward things that haven't historically been rewarded. I think another critically important thing about improving DEI through education is learning to connect dots. And instead of seeing individual performances or individual students as such, learning to recognize patterns and think systemically as it concerns how diversity is related to equity and inclusion, how admissions is related to outreach and recruitment, how mentoring is implicated in our capacity for future recruitment. So learning to think in terms of the complex systems that we know are in place in physical reality and see those in place within education is vital. Something that physicists are great with that should be deployed regularly if it's not already being done is to be data-driven and to use those equity checks as part of any sort of change management process. If you're not already evaluating the impacts of whatever changes you've been making and then learning to bring that local data in addition to some success stories that you have, I think that's a really critical thing that you can do to maintain energy. And then I think the more you can open up any of your processes to discussion and reflection, we know that discussion and reflection are two of the most important mechanisms for learning and for change. And what a leader can do is something as mundane as a faculty meeting, having a short reading from, I don't know, Inside Higher Education or the Harvard Business Review that's related to change management, and making that a normal part of how we operate. The last thing I'll just mention is a tool that is really useful. And again, all of these are necessary but not sufficient on their own. But there's increasing evidence about the value of evaluation rubrics in our instruction, in our admissions, and in faculty hiring, in their ability to manage some of the implicit and explicit biases that we tend to bring to evaluation. They bring structure and fairness to processes that can otherwise be ad hoc. They're more likely to produce similarities in ratings that have some degree of subjectivity to them. And they are useful tools in helping to defend against charges of unfairness that might come to us from students, from aggrieved applicants, or even from faculty candidates who are not so sure that our processes are fair. So there's a lot that can be done, but those are just a few of the most important things that I see as relatively low-hanging fruit.
Thank you. Professor Gao, you have been very active in DNP, and where a lot of these issues are dealt with. Could you share with us any particular things is happening in that division that could be useful for our particle physics division?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to share some of the activities that are happening in the Division of Nuclear Physics. And our division has a very active committee on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this committee now is has become a standing committee in DMP. And the committee has been working very closely with the DMP Executive Committee and also the DMP Education Committee. And this committee has been, DI committee has been instrumental in the DI ALIS program, and has been providing excellent chair training sessions to all DMP 4 and also APO APS meeting. And the DI committee also has been organizing DI meetings and forums at the DMP for DMP and also for APS meeting. For example, on the discussion on collaboration code of conduct, and also particularly on mechanism when you have a violation, how you address that. And currently the committee also has a number of other very good works, activities in the works, like the best practices for our DMP committees when it comes to running meetings, choosing speakers, choosing committee membership, choosing candidates for ballots, etc. And the current DMP leader also sees, we see it as our responsibility to make sure members can do physics in a welcoming and safe environment, and are proactively looking for ways to improve and keep our members safe. When it comes to nominations for committee membership, DMP has the notion or point of view, who is really the best person for this position. As some of you may also know that the Department of Energy has been funding research traineeships to broaden and diversify nuclear physics. And this is a pilot program intended, here I quote, support training and research experiences for members of underserved communities with the goal of increasing the likelihood that participants from underrepresented populations, such as those present at minority serving institutions, will pursue a career in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics related field, particularly in nuclear physics. Several awards have now been established across the country, supporting approximately 60 students, and we refer them as DMP Scholars. And these scholars have incredible potential, and the DMP meeting is a fantastic opportunity to expose them to the richness of our field, encourage them to identify their passion and see a path to realize it. The DMP wants to enable a welcoming environment for these students when they participate in future DMP meetings. So we have this is the goal of the DMP Scholars Program. And primarily, it provides guidance and support to the Dmp scholars as they navigate the large conference setting of the Dmp for meeting. In addition to the Dmp Scholars program for the MSI trainees, there is an effort to create Dmp ambassadors to formally liaise with professional societies serving marginalized physicists. And Dmp Executive Committee and the Dmp DI Committee work closely in using research and data to take a frequent pulse of the culture and build guardrails that improve the culture. And lastly, I also want to mention that Dmp has been running a highly successful program since 1998 on conference experience for undergraduates, short name is CEU, and is held in conjunction with the fall Dmp meeting each year. It includes poster session for the presentation of the students' research. And since 2019, we now also have additional sorting category for undergraduate research, so students can submit abstract for oral presentations. So these are just some of the activities related to DEI and also the workforce development in general from the Dmp. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Gates, are you still with us? Oh, internet issue. All right. Okay, so we'll go to Professor Black. Would you please comment on how do we match best practices with value of an organization? For example, what you are doing in CMS.
Sure, I can speak a little bit to that. So one of the things that I'm doing is that on CMS, we had kind of formulated two task force, one that works, the second one that I'm actually co-chairing. And so the first one identified, we decided, besides having our diversity office and other types of issues, we should also have a dedicated task force to look and try to understand what the most important issues were in our collaboration regarding DE&I and what we could do about that to improve them. And so they came up with basically a list of 7 high-level recommendations that cover things from systematic collection of data, things like asking for surveys, climate surveys, actually keeping records of who held what position, who got what awards, and things like that over time. That was not recorded actually at all, which was interesting. Having clear procedures and criteria for management positions that we choose, and indicating what those are before you make a call, and how the process is going to work, and how the process of what person gets chosen for that is going to work. Training for management, we have a lot of management in these large collaborations, and not everyone who is necessarily a great scientist is necessarily a great manager or has soft people skills. And so teaching those skills of being able to navigate that aspect of it, mentoring as for career development for younger people as they come up the ladder of both management and also in their scientific career, and also having some sort of diversity and monitoring oversight group that looks to see how we're doing periodically and reviews things and sees are we making progress on these issues. Also to look at the technological practices, that we have this ever-changing world in terms of communication. If you compare where we were 20 years ago to being on phone meetings or either on person with plastic slides, to now where it's everyone's just on Zoom and connecting. And that also has been accelerated by COVID, where we all went online, and we were all making presentations and teaching classes and things like that online, and making best use of that changing technology and how to practices to have people who are remote and in present be able to participate effectively. And finally, to develop resources, a systematic way, any project that you would have in particle physics, anything that you wanted to build for a detector or do computing or software, the first thing that you would need for your project is some resources to do it. And that's one of the components which is often overlooked in terms of DEI efforts, is actually, having specific resources that you can do that. So we're trying. So that was the first task force, and now I am in charge of the leading the second task force. that's responsible for implementing those things. And so this has been a very long process. It was about a year of work. Joel was one of the chairs of that, and I see many other members in the audience who were on the first task force, and there are other members who are also on the second task force. And we hoped to finish this up this calendar year, but we'll also have to be continuing efforts. And so it's a reminder that this is one of the things that is said before, consensus is difficult to reach, especially with 3,000 people, especially with an international collaboration where you have members from different communities and different groups who have vastly different ideas about what equity and inclusion means and how you're supposed to implement it and what processes are okay. And so it's been a real education for me also individually of learning about what different people from different backgrounds and different groups think that we should do. And it's a lot of work to just come to the conclusions that this is something that we should do and what those best practices are, let alone actually being able to implement them. So it's a continued, certainly not, unfortunately, I'm not in the position to say I'm some expert on how to do this for large collaborations, but I think it's something that we're learning all together, and many people are involved. A group of 20 people now and 20 people or so before, so are really actively engaged in that process.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, we won't go through the rest of the questions, so we'll try to close the session at this time. So I will ask my colleague to come.
All right, so this has been a really excellent discussion, and we would particularly like to thank all our panelists for lending us your perspective and expertise, and